Hello and welcome everyone to our October meeting of Conscious Capitalism Rochester. We actually had quite a few people sign up. We should be, depending on how many end up signing up live, but we had 90 RSVPs. So this was definitely a topic that really struck a chord, and we're really excited to have this panel here today. I know that many of you will be just kind of streaming in. We're just 1 minute past the hour, so some people will be joining, but I'll just get started briefly to give an overview of conscious capitalism, especially for those that have not been to one of our meetings, because I saw quite a few names that signed up that we had never seen before, which is wonderful. And we hope you enjoy the conversation today, and certainly hope that you'll join us again. Conscious Capitalism Rochester is a local chapter, obviously here in Rochester, of a worldwide movement called Conscious Capitalism, which was started in 2007. There was a book called Firms of Endearment written by Raj Sisodia that really tried to key in on what was some of the ways that there was companies that were setting themselves apart. In these companies had four key tenets that Raj noted that came to be known as conscious capitalism. And the first was a higher purpose. A higher purpose beyond just making profits. You need profits to survive. You got to keep the lights on, especially, there's struggles with that, now more than ever. But at the same time, the purpose of the company can and maybe even should go beyond that. And the way that engages employees at a different level, the way that gets your customers to be more loyal, that really provides a differentiator for companies these days. Now, they also had a stakeholder orientation. So rather than prioritizing the needs of stockholders, it's how do we balance the needs of the customers, the community, the employees, the environment, really the broader society that this company depends on for its long-term survival and thriving. And so we'll certainly get to talk a lot about stakeholders today during our conversation. Next element was conscious leadership. Hopefully that's why all of you are here, because leaders need to grow for the organization to grow. If you can put all those wonderful messages out there, you can have the fancy plaque up on the wall or the page on your website about your values and your mission. But if the leader isn't a servant leader, isn't really living and embodying that purpose, it's going to be difficult for the organization to really fulfill that potential. The last of the four is a conscious culture. So these companies really value and prioritize the well-being of all of their employees at a holistic level, and the growth of those individuals as well. And so the great news was that not only were these companies doing well by doing good, but they're actually doing better. They ended up beating S&P 500 by 14 times over a 15-year period. And so this was a way to do business in a more holistic way, and really a way for long-term growth. And so that really fits in nicely with our conversation that we're having today, which is about the intersection of sustainability and social justice. I certainly believe, and it's been clear in terms of some of the rhetoric going around in the news and around society, that these are some of the greatest challenges that we face in our society today. And at the same time, sometimes maybe too often, they're seen as separate issues and seen as things that need to be tackled separately, or discussions on how to prioritize one versus the other. Whereas we really see it, and I think hopefully if you don't already see it that way, you'll maybe by the end of the day today see how those are inextricably linked, and really how they can be reinforcing when we tackle both of them. So really excited for our panel today. Just one quick note before we get started. I wanted to share some information on a community forum happening as part of the Race Commission, the Commission on Racial and Structural Equity in Rochester. I'm sorry, that's showing up a little bit small there, but tomorrow, 6 to 8 p.m., they're really looking for feedback from minority and women-owned businesses on some of the challenges that have been faced and in the past. And as many of you may know, this Racial and Structural Equity Commission is really tasked with how to identify those barriers and look at things from a systemic and structural level. So you may be on the call today, and you may fit and want to join. You may know somebody, so please pass that along, because it's a really great opportunity for some meaningful change in our community. But without further ado, I'm going to spend about 10 minutes with each of our panelists, and then we'll spend the final 30 with conversation from the audience and among the panelists. So feel free in the Q&A to drop any questions you have. I'll work that into the conversation if I can, or save it till the end. And I will just make a point of briefly introducing each of our panelists as we go along. But I wanted to start with Simeon Banister, and the reason being, Simeon is the Vice President of Community Programs at the Rochester Area Community Foundation. which is responsible for he's responsible for the grant making and community leadership. And I always learned so much from Simeon, kind of to put things in historical context. And I'd love it, Simeon, if you could just kind of set the stage for us a little bit, especially for those that may not have seen sustainability connected with racial and social justice, to talk a little bit about how those things have been linked historically, both obviously at the country level and even at the global level, but certainly here in Rochester.
Yeah, thank you so much for the welcome to the conversation, Andrew, and I'm so glad to be with such a wonderful panel of really insightful speakers, and looking forward to hearing what everyone has to share. I think from a historical perspective, if we ground ourselves in kind of what has transpired here, I believe that there are some breadcrumbs that lead us to potential solutions that we might be able to take. It's certainly the case that here in Rochester, we've seen a disparate impact with respect to issues around environment and climate change. And that's undeniable. And it shows up in everything from the vacuum oil plant on Exchange Street and the implications for that neighborhood, a problem that was literally over 100 years in the making, almost 100 years now in the making, that's had tremendous implications, both economic and environmental, for neighbors in the Plex neighborhood, to the distribution of housing, where that housing is proximate. Those are all tremendous challenges. But we know that there are some watershed moments in the history of Rochester. We know, for example, that the Home Owners Loan Corporation, the HOLC map of Rochester, what we know is the red line map, disprivileged people of color in this community like it did in cities across the country. And we know that the way that it did so was that it limited the housing options in the neighborhoods that folks could live in. We know that in the 1950s, less than 2% of the population in Rochester was people of color, and that as we saw the economic growth of the city, that many of people of color were either excluded on the periphery or were absent, just weren't here. We know that growth in Rochester happened in the early 20th century with Xerox and Kodak and so on and so forth. But we also know that as those organizations grew, that the pollutants and the other runoff that came from those companies as a result of the industrialization had a tremendous impact in Rochester. And when we think about those locations, the locations of brownfields in our community, we see a direct connection with communities of color. We also know that kind of through time, as those companies began to recede in their economic dominance, particularly on the global stage, we know that in the declination of resources that they were introducing into Rochester, a higher proportion of those resources were distributed to our suburban communities. And I want to be clear that we're not setting up a binary here. It's not suburbs versus the city. But we recognize that our entire region is undermined by gross inequity that is kind of kneecapping our approach to respond to the challenges that are in front of us. Last thing I'll say on this is COVID-19 is yet another example that is right in our face. I fear that as we start to move forward, if we replicate the same patterns of inequity, that will only undermine our recovery to yet another set of economic challenges. And that was certainly true, frankly, in the Great Recession, where a lack of inequitable practices exacerbated some of the issues around poverty. One thing I'll say, Andrew, is environment represents a wonderful opportunity for this community. Climate change and the green jobs revolution, if we repeat the past, disparate outcomes, disparate access, then we will no doubt continue to see the same kinds of challenges. But in this new burgeoning field, if we create more equity and shared prosperity, I'm confident that that sets Rochester on a stronger path forward.
Thanks so much. Yeah, really, really an important way to see it. And as many have noted, kind of, I think early on of this pandemic, there was a lot of people saying, we're all in this together. And while in some ways that may be true, there's certainly disparate impacts. And many of those fall along racial lines, and many of those are because of those historical inequities and the ways that we've set up our system. I'm curious, you are doing so much work in trying to broaden the impact to go from at the Community Foundation really, smaller programs or really focused programs that are maybe band-aids on the current situation. Not to say that we certainly don't need some of those emergency services, especially at a time like this, but what are some of the ways that you all are trying to tackle things, to really get at the root of some of these issues?
Sure. Yeah. So we've tried to take a approach again that's informed by the history, right? And so, you heard me say earlier that 1950, less than 2% of the population in Rochester was people of color. What's the implication there? The implication is that we have that communities of color in our city, relative to places that are like us, Detroit or Pittsburgh or other places, is a relatively recent phenomenon, right? And what that relatively recent phenomenon means is that we haven't seen the kind of institutional development, right? Because when people of color got here, remember what I said, at the same time, resources were leaving the city of Rochester. So we haven't seen that kind of institutional development. So we recently at the Community Foundation launched the Racial Equity Growth Fund. And that growth fund is intended to identify where there are innovative, gap-filling opportunities, ideas that are being generated from the community, including in the area of environment and climate change, adaptation and response, so that we can provide dollars, the kind of risk capital, to help folks kind of stand up the infrastructure that's generated by the community to solve the community's challenges. That's a little bit different than historically what we've seen here in Rochester, but we think that that's an essential part of the strategy as we move forward. We're encouraging folks to engage. The other thing is we recently launched, it's in a soft launch phase right now, the Equitable Nonprofit Finder. It's a tool that helps us to give a graphic depiction of both economic deprivation, but that economic deprivation is two sides of the same coin. The other side of that coin is opportunity areas for investment. And so we're encouraging folks to take a look at that. It's at the website. If you just go to Equitable Nonprofit Finder, you can check it out. And it's a map. It's a graphic depiction along with a connection with organizations that are working in respective neighborhoods, so that we can help bring resources closer to the neighborhoods where folks are feeling the pain the most. We think that those kinds of strategies of adding more context and information, and then driving more resources, real dollars for innovation into communities, is going to give us a good head start for starting to remediate some of the challenges that we've had.
Wow. Thanks so much for all the work that you're doing and for kind of setting us off that way. I want to turn now to Pamela Sanchez, the president and CEO of the Seneca Park Zoo Society, because I think it presents an interesting way to look at these intertwined issues. First, from the area of the Community Foundation that may traditionally be more focused on the racial equity issues and social justice issues, and working in that sustainability, and then kind of complementing that with Pamela at the zoo, where the zoo, many people don't recognize how much the zoo is involved in conservation. But then the zoo is coming at it from the other side of really more traditionally focused on the sustainability. And I know that Pamela and her team at the zoo have for a long time been also focused on some of the ways that there are racial and structural equity issues that are at play. So Pamela, welcome so much, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. It's really a privilege, and to be with Simeon and Ram and Kamillah. This is wonderful. Thank you for the opportunity. And I know that many people might be wondering why someone from a zoo is on this panel and what social justice has to do with the zoo. And that's because many people aren't familiar with what contemporary zoos really are or understand our why. So let's start there. Zoos are conservation organizations, as you said, and we are committed to saving animals from extinction. How do we do that? Well, there's lots of science that happens, and there's also participation in international and regional conservation efforts, but our mission is about people. Our mission is about inspiring people to connect with, care for, and conserve wildlife and wild places. And when we talk about our community, we're not talking about the 400,000 people that visit the zoo in a normal non-pandemic year. We're talking about everybody in the region, because conservation cannot belong to a subset of people, and conservation cannot be seen as a luxury. Your clean air and my clean water depend on all of us. So we want people who visit the zoo or who participate in an outreach program that we have to leave learning at least one thing that they can do to make a difference for our planet and the animals that inhabit it. We want them to leave feeling hopeful and knowing that they can make an action that can change the course of endangered species. After all, endangered isn't extinct. Endangered means there's still time to act, right? So individual actions that can impact conservation are by and large about sustainable living. If we make choices that improve sustainability, collectively we make an impact. So we're talking about things like responsible consumerism, lowering our carbon footprint, recycling, using reusable products, growing our own vegetables. But I'm getting way far ahead of myself because we've got to back up. Because before we can expect people to make these changes, they have to be motivated to do so. So more than 50 years ago, Senegalese forest engineer Baba Douam said, "In the end, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand, and when we will understand only what we are taught." And I've seen this paraphrased in other ways as we will only protect what we love and we can only love what we know. But the concept of having someone teach us, show us, introduce us, that's a really important concept in this. But what if you grow up without access to nature or without an adult in your life who introduces you to nature? What if you live a quarter mile from one of the most environmentally important rivers in the United States and never know that it's there? What if you live 6 miles from one of the world's largest sources of fresh water and never visit the shorelines? The great biologist and naturalist E.O. Wilson, who many people consider the father of biodiversity, has written texts on biophilia, the natural human tendency to interact with other forms of life. We want to commune with nature. And for many of us who grow up in the suburbs or in rural areas, nature is part of our everyday. You know, we grew up catching fireflies on the front steps, there are toads in the cellar window boxes, we visited friends and relatives at their summer homes on the Finger Lakes in the Adirondacks, the thousand islands. We spent hours communing with nature. But that experience is not universal. And in fact, for children who grow up without access to nature, they experience the opposite of biophilia, biophobia. And this disconnection from nature causes fear of animals, of wildlife, of insects, of flying things, hopping things, slithering things. Fear leads to a desire to want to eliminate. Fear rarely leads to a desire to want to learn, let alone sustain. So kill the bee that might sting me, destroy the spider and its web. Don't worry about running over the snake in the road or stomping on that beetle. But here's the thing of it. Spending time in nature is good for our physical and mental health. Scientific studies prove a really strong connection between time spent in nature and reduced negative emotions, anxiety, depression, insomnia, tension headaches, even indigestion. And new studies are showing that time spent in a zoo produce these same results. We all can benefit from nature, and we all deserve to benefit from it. But we're working against two crucial things: biophobia and inequitable access to nature. So if I'm scared of nature, why would I head out on a trail along the Genesee River or up to Durand Eastman Park, right? If I don't feel safe, whether because of the non-humans or the humans that are there, I'm not going to go. And if it's something I have to seek out, go out of my way for, need transportation to, and I'm either a 12-year-old or I'm a mom working 2 jobs and juggling 3 kids, it's not going to happen. So we have generations of people who are growing up without access to nature, without its mental and physical benefits, and without gaining an affinity for nature and the intricate connections among the flora and fauna that we share the planet with. And those intricate connections include how our actions directly impact our air quality and our water quality. So this is not unique to the city of Rochester, and it's not even unique to urban settings. It's true in nearly every corner of the world, because when we're disconnected from nature, distracted by things like how we're going to feed our family and how we're going to get money to pay the rent, making choices about sustainable living is not part of what we do. It's completely irrelevant to us. Economic security and appreciation for nature have to go hand in hand as we design programs that incentivize sustainability and conservation. So part of what we do at the Zoo Society and the zoo is in Madagascar, we are deeply involved in reforestation projects that provide living wages to private landowners to plant and grow trees for the years before the trees bear fruit or are large enough to host vanilla vines and provide income. So they're planting, they're monitoring, they're tracking the trees. That's their job that they're paid for, rather than slashing and burning the trees for lumber and charcoal. It's a major shift, and having been there for the second time earlier this year before the world shut down, revisiting our reforestation sites, I can tell you this shift really is happening. There's value for the Malagasy people in these projects, and there's great pride. Here in Rochester, we launched the Urban Ecologist Workforce Development Program a few years ago, and the program employs youth from the city of Rochester for up to 2 years. They learn about urban ecology, they find their voices, they become ambassadors for nature, for their families and for their neighborhoods. They're delivering programs at rec centers where they're teaching younger children about the value of bees and spiders. They're exploring our region's incredible economic or environmental assets. And they're working right now with the Mayor's Council on Youth on creating a nature bill of rights for children in our region. They're learning that there's career options available to them related to conservation and the environment. And maybe most importantly, they're learning about environmental justice and the need for their voices to be heard, including at the ballot box. I describe the program sometimes as a pebble that drops into a lake that creates ripples. It may be a small pebble, but its impact is continuing to spread as it enriches the lives of the youth that involved, the youth that they inspire, and the possibilities for this community as these young people take their place. If you ask the urban ecologists what problem they're trying to solve, they will tell you it's inequitable access to nature, because they know now. They have found nature brings them solace and calm, and they've felt the way that nature helps them focus, and they care deeply about its survival. So that's it. Sustainability and social justice are inextricably linked, and they're linked to personal economic security. And my job, our job, is to continue to remove the barriers to equitable access to nature so that we can all benefit from nature and choose to live sustainably on its behalf. So, I mean, it's a big lift. Like I said, it is a ripple, but we've got to start somewhere. And to have this crew of 15 young people who are as committed to breaking down those barriers to inequitable access to nature as I am, it's powerful. But again, that economic security, these are paid programs. You just can't expect people to do the right thing because it's the right thing, you know? So.
Thank you so much, Pamela. And it's been an honor getting to know you and getting to know more about the zoo over the last several years, because I grew up as a young kid going to the zoo, and we had a zoo membership, but I don't think until relatively recently recognized all of the ways, both locally and around the world, that you are really making an impact in both of these areas, in the sustainability and the environmental justice, but also in the racial and social injustices in our society. So thank you for that work. And I want to maybe I'll save one question until when we get back to the group discussion, but doing a lot of work to highlight other organizations as well through the Environmental Innovation Awards and Symposium, because there's a lot of great green shoots, so to speak, here in Rochester that we'd love to celebrate more. But for right now, I do want to turn it over to Ram Shrivastava, who was actually one of our founding members of Conscious Capitalism Rochester. So thanks Ram for believing in us from the very beginning. And I think part of that is because Ram, at Larsen Engineers, where the mission is to help create sustainable green communities, you, I think, are a very conscious organization, but also the clients that you're working with and the types of organizations that you're supporting and the projects you're working on are also very conscious. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the ways, again, kind of building off of the things that Simeon was mentioning, in terms of some of the ways that industrial properties, waste management facilities, sometimes get located in areas that have, either been disenfranchised or aren't as well organized or aren't as well funded, and some of the things that you're doing now to try to mitigate some of those things?
First of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to join this panel. That is very good input. I learned a few things already through listening to Simeon and Pamela, and I've attended those annual events for awarding excellence in these projects. But we have been involved with these environmental projects ever since I came to Larsen in 1969. So I've been here for a long time, as you can count, 5 decades. But the most interesting work in the environment is happening in the last 10 years. And that's the reason that I continue to enjoy and do things which are nature-based and getting more towards a simple natural solution. So example of projects, just to give folks an idea, the sustainability where you design sustainable green solutions. The best example I have is I-Square, which happens to be right next to the House of Guitar. There is a facility, 4 acres. This developer, Mr. Nelson, he's working on a whole new example of what sustainability and recycling is. Every drop of water that falls when it rains is recycled and restored and doesn't go through a sewer pipe. You see solar panels, you see windmills, you see utilization of recycled products, waste recycling. So that's one project in one spot. We were able to implement those things that anybody visiting there, other than having ice cream, coffee, or whatever, or listening to some music outside, you learn about that there are ways to do things better. Coming closer to the city of Rochester, there's an organization that I've been involved as a board member called Greentopia. Some of you may have heard about them, but they were doing projects in the city. Example would be Green Vision, which is a great program that Greentopia has been doing. Eco District is another project that is creating an opportunity in a very central area of the city to show examples of green design, green measures. So we have been involved with the training of youth. So Green Vision is a program where high school level kids and folks who are looking for direction are giving some training in growing things. So they grow flowers. These flowers are sold in Wegmans. There is a training program that teaches these kids to save money, to learn their paid stipend. And they are shown a way that they could go to MCC for 2 years degree for free as far as their tuition is concerned, but it's funded by local businesses. So they're creating learning centers, learning opportunities. And where I see the connection with environmental engineering is a lot of solutions are nature-based. So imagine a brownfield area or a contaminated site in the city, and there's no shortage of it. There's a lot of areas, including the Plex neighborhood that Simeon talked about. There are areas, land areas that are contaminated. People are scared of doing something about it. And conventional solutions are just not affordable. They will sit there for another 10, 15 years because you don't have $15 million. But there are natural solutions that we can have neighborhood people get involved in demonstrating natural technology, plants and grown and things which can treat the soil. And after a year or two, the soil is cleaned up. So we're really supporting nature-based solutions for buildings, for facilities, and we see a lot of potential that these sites could become a source for generating value. And a good way to do it would be the energy sector. We're involved with these community solar projects. A lot of land may not be suitable for more housing, but this parcel of land could certainly have on top of it solar panels to produce energy that can be sold to a low and medium income housing for a much lower cost, so people living there can have 25 years of cheap solar power, and you've used the site for producing power. The same sites could be the location where you can have waste management or other training or growing things that could be beneficial above ground, could be source of food source, and give them jobs for local people. So there's a lot of opportunity that exists within the cities. We just need to work with local agencies and, most importantly, funding sources. The capital is very, very important. And I see this group called Conscious Capitalists having companies, industries, factories, people who want to invest money in community. This is the time for you to invest some of those dollars as an impact investment to make an impact on Rochester. So that's my big picture.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. And Ram, I'm curious if there are, when you're talking about funding or talking about some of these things that need to happen, is there anything going on in Rochester, at the policy level that could really have a broader impact or help to spur some of these changes? Or kind of alternately, is there anything that you've seen in other communities where they're really doing things well in some of these areas that we might be able to learn from?
Well, one example would be the Albany area. There is a savings and loan association, a bank, that helped in that community to set up in one of those districts in the city with problem areas. They raised money to be able to buy it's like a trailer, just you see a shipping container. So it's a shipping container, but inside it has all the things you need for growing vegetables and products. It's a vertical garden inside a mobile trailer. So they provided that to a neighborhood to teach people how to grow healthy food, healthy habits. It becomes an educational center. And they are able to show that health is important and they need to eat healthy foods. So they are creating a hub where people can come, work together, grow things. In Rochester, we have FoodLink, we have lots of banks and Eastman Savings and Loan. Perhaps something like that could be done in each neighborhood to show people that they can themselves be self-sufficient. I guess we need to be independent in some way. A lot of people look for solution from somebody else. Well, get involved and solve your own problem, working with folks locally that have resources.
Yeah, that's such a great example. I love it when some of these things are being addressed, but while you're doing it, you're also building that sense of neighborhood, building that sense of community pride. That really goes a long way, and I think it starts almost like this positive upward spiral. Whereas when there's more pride in the community, then they want to invest more, then they want to bring more people in, and it becomes an attractor. And so I think that when we do start to create some of that pride and hopefully some of the beauty too in the neighborhood, and as Pamela was mentioning, some of the access to nature, even if it's how can we make that happen in a vacant lot on our block, those sorts of things can really be a seed for that positive change. Thanks so much, Ram. And I want to then shift because one of the things I've been trying to do with many of our conversations over the last little while, since we've had to switch to virtual, is to try to look for the silver lining. One of which is that we can invite in perspectives from outside the Rochester community that we may not normally be able to hear from. And so that's certainly true. And last but most definitely not least is Kamillah Knight. She's a co-founder of Eclat Culture, and she has experience working for major CPG companies, most recently at Unilever in a diversity and inclusion role. So at a very large company that's really well known for some of the sustainability work that they're doing, some of the global work that they're doing on the sustainable development goals, but also being able to address that and be internally in a diversity and inclusion role. And I know that there's so many stories to share. So Kamillah, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Without having been as familiar as maybe some of you are being in Rochester with the program, I have loved sitting here and listening to all of the different initiatives and how you all are thinking about how you're approaching diversity and inclusion from the sustainability perspective. I have, for one, have been a huge advocate of pushing the conversation around how diversity and inclusion and sustainability are related. The way I tend to look at things is really through the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you aren't familiar with them, there are 17 of them that have come out from the United Nations. And I feel like as you look through and really break them down and look at the different goals that are associated under each of the 11, there's no way you can't look at them without thinking of diversity and inclusion. At Unilever, there are plenty of things that some of our different brands and that the company has done, which is, helped to further that thought, especially because the company is extremely sustainability forward. And of course, sitting in the position of being the diversity and inclusion lead, I had the luxury of being a part of some of the great initiatives that happened. And I'll give you a few examples. One of my favorites is an initiative from one of our largest brands, Dove, which is centered around the Dove Crown Act, or the Crown Act, which you may have heard of, and it's passed in several states thus far. Dove was a huge proponent in creating the Crown Act, as well as donating a lot of the funds, as Ram talked about, and putting the money behind it, to really initiate this thing that really looks at how can we eradicate race-based hair discrimination in both schools and workplaces. And when you really think about it, that ties to some of the SDGs that talk about a fair workspace, or that talk about quality education, because frankly speaking, quite often when people who have natural hair textures or protective styles like the braids in my hair today, you can be discriminated against and either not be included, not hired, and so many other things. In addition to that, the Dove Men Plus Care brand has been doing a lot of work behind paternity leave and making sure that we're talking about and lobbying, even from a legislative perspective, dads taking paternity leave and normalizing that, which adds to the quality of the home, and making sure that children, aren't without their dads, and can have that bonding time, which adds, in some of the sustainable development goals as well, especially including those like, no poverty, or good health and well-being, because of the mental health and space it builds around that family dynamic. In addition to that, Dove Men Plus Care has also done a lot of work behind what they call Father's Day Taken. So specifically this past year, they focused on the fact that oftentimes Black dads have lost their lives due to either racism or violence, and therefore are taken from their homes. So they've pledged over $1 million in addition to the monies that they've pledged in taking paternity leave, but to really help families who are in need, which again can address a lot of those things in the sustainable development goals. And then another of my favorites is of course Ben and Jerry's, which focuses on things like the legal system and the justice around that, the racial injustice, democracy, GMO labeling, as well as climate justice, and so many more, and really helping to start conversations and to push people into spaces that can be usually uncomfortable, but to really create change. And then furthermore, just in thinking about how can smaller groups or organizations that aren't halfway as large as a Unilever really push some of these things, because I do think it's something that we all can do, big or small, is just by taking the time to really look at what is your mission as an organization? What are some of the things that you're already doing that you can lean into that can potentially address some of these things that are being called out in the SDGs? If you simply even go on, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals website, they even have it broken out right now where you can look at some of the things that have been exacerbated by COVID-19, for instance, which can generate ideas for how, your organizations can lean in. And then furthermore, just looking at, once again, the goals that are broken out underneath all of the Sustainable Development Goals, you can see small things that maybe you can lean into. So for instance, Sustainable Development Goal number 1 focuses on no poverty. And one of the goals is by 2030 to reduce at least by half the proportion of men and women and children of all ages living in poverty. And I think, plenty of us have talked about some of the things that are associated with poverty, and how that's, once again, related to not only sustainable development, but also racial injustice and disparities. Another example is something like good health and well-being. So strengthening the capacity of all countries, in particular, developing countries for early warning or risk reduction and management of national and global health risks. So COVID-19, prime example. And I'm sure, again, there are plenty of ways that we as people and in our organizations can lean in to help support that sustainable development goal.
Wow. So lucky to have you joining us on this panel, because those are so many great examples, and obviously such a large organization, you're not on in on every one of those decisions, but I'm thinking about Ben and Jerry's especially, but certainly with any of these types of organizations, I'm wondering if you could shed any light on some of the decision-making processes. When you're taking a stand or determining whether maybe there's some listeners right now determining whether to advocate for certain issues and some of the things that need to be decided on. And obviously there's always, I'd like to think anyways, they're going to be on the right side of history, but there's certainly risks involved in any kind of advocacy efforts. What kinds of conversations go on at the leadership level in terms of deciding, how far to go?
Yeah, and so that's where my diversity and inclusion hat really comes in, right? Because it's making sure that, number one, we have people with diverse perspectives around the table who can really shed light on some of the things that we need to lean into, as well as involving different people throughout the business to truly understand, again, what our mission is that's associated with different brands, and what would make the best sense even from the resources that we already have as an organization, and then things that we're already doing and how we can tie it back to the community to drive some of these changes. And then, of course, consulting again from the diversity and inclusion perspective to really shed light on what are some of the largest issues that we're facing as a country or as a globe, and where should we show up most as a company.
Hmm. And I know then that you're starting to look at doing this in a consultative level, really trying to build relationships, help drive some of this change. Really ties in certainly with kind of both the conscious culture certainly of conscious capitalism, but also that stakeholder orientation. When you are dealing with the needs of a broad number of stakeholders with different visions and different ideas and different backgrounds, that relationship building and some of the the messy diplomacy, for lack of a better term, of working through that. I know that's one of your kind of strengths, and so maybe for those that are interested in trying to build more of those collaborative, long-term stakeholder type of relationships, any thoughts or ideas or advice for those that are trying to start down that path and how to strengthen that?
Absolutely. One of my favorite tools in the world is LinkedIn, and just reading all the different things that people are doing, connecting with people based on common interests, and then setting up, informal chats, even to learn about, how can I partner with them. Also, just looking in general at partnerships that align with your organization's mission, because if you don't necessarily have the tools or the capacity within your employee base to truly lean into some of these things, you can also achieve some of your goals that are associated with diversity and inclusion and sustainability simply based on partnerships. And as Ram mentioned, really putting the funding behind it. So those would be my two largest examples of it.
Great. So I do want to just remind everyone listening, please throw any questions you have into the Q&A. We have a brilliant panel here, and I'm really excited for the next half hour to just kind of dive in with all of them now that we have a little bit of a level set in terms of where everyone's coming from and their experiences. But the first question that I'm seeing is coming from Drew, and it's directed at Pamela, but after she has a chance to respond, certainly any of the panelists that want to jump in. But Drew's wondering about hypercapitalism and kind of this privilege of access. Access, especially as a conservation professional, and how do we make moves to reduce that kind of privilege and that priority? And what might a new conservation look like going forward? That's a great question, Drew. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for that, Drew. That's like this huge 3-hour-long beginning to discuss it question, right? So I talked about the equitable access to nature, and getting people to feel comfortable there is one piece of it, or feel like they're welcome there. And we do that at the zoo. We really are working hard to provide an inclusive environment so people not only feel welcome, they feel like they're a part of the place. And at a zoo, for some reason, everyone does feel welcome. And you walk around knowing you don't have to look a certain way, dress a certain way, have a certain education. Nature doesn't feel like that all the time. And I know myself as somebody who's a fledgling naturalist, honestly, late in my life, coming to that, I sometimes don't feel comfortable out. And there are some cultural things that people of privilege do out in nature, like looking askance at people who don't look like them, and making people not feel comfortable. And I think we all have to be okay with being uncomfortable for a while. And I don't yet know how to make people who look like me be okay with feeling uncomfortable as other people share trails, except to say, get over yourselves, because this is essential. Because if if we want to continue to see, you know, the warblers come through every year and watch the kestrels and on all of that, we all have to care about it. As I said, it can't belong to one subset. It's a huge nut that we're trying to crack because it's not about just bottom up. It's got to be everybody. So, hey, Drew, if you've got an answer to that.
Anybody else want to jump in there?
Sure. I would just chime in. You know, it's interesting because, you know, an analogy, if you will, for the poker players that are out there, if you've got, you know, a number of folks that are kind of at the table playing the game, and let's just say that by dint of merit, right? So let's not even include, you know, having a card up the sleeve or maybe kind of, you know, rigging the game a little bit, but just by merit, if there's one player that's better than all the players and they keep collecting the chips and collecting the chips and collecting the chips, ultimately what happens? The game's over. And I think that's ultimately what we have to ask ourselves as we think about, you know, the way our system operates is, you know, how long do we want to have, you know, kind of sustainability or not? Do we want to lean in or not? And I think that's fundamentally the question that we have to engage. Now, there's some really interesting things that are happening in the economy right now. And if you'll just give me, you know, 1 second to just kind of elucidate, we are, you know, we have exhausted interest rates, as we all know, are very low. We have exhausted the limitations of monetary policy, I think a lot of people would argue. And there is a move that's happening to really kind of embrace the kind of Keynesian model of fiscal policy again, right? The thing that I find myself very concerned about is that municipalities and perhaps the country itself will start to borrow. And as we go through that exercise, the question is, how do we borrow? Do we borrow in a way that uses resources to drive innovation and risk-taking and shared prosperity and equitable growth? Or do we continue to do what we've been doing, in some ways through quantitative easing, driving more and more dollars into fewer and fewer hands in a way that ends our poker game? And I think, to me, what we want to think about is how we create, again, shared prosperity and more equity and more innovation. And one way to do that, that's such a powerful channel that we have at our disposal, is through environmental solutions, where there's so much, you know, pregnant opportunity for innovation and rethinking how our economy operates. Andrew, you and I have talked in the past about, you know, capitalism, conscious capitalism, and I think both of us can agree that our system is not just a capitalist system, right? There's a lot of features from a lot of different traditions. There's, you know, elements of oligarchy, and there's elements of socialism, and there's elements of, right? And so in this cauldron, again, the question is, how do we turn the dials a little bit more effectively so that we kind of play up the elements of our economy that are going to be most efficacious for broader sustainability? And I think that's what we're hoping that folks are willing to do, is to take a different approach, particularly in this moment. Don't do what we've done in the past because we know it doesn't work, right? Let's try something different.
Yeah, just jump in really quick there because I think that, you know, Raj's latest book, The Healing Organization, really touches on that quite a bit. Is, you know, if there was less damage being left in the wake of the kind of neoliberal, you know, greed is good type of capitalism, there would be a lot less cleanup to do for the rest of society, and that should be definitely a part of it. And yeah, as you're mentioning, we certainly don't have you know, free markets as some would claim. I think somebody else is jumping in. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the other part of that I would offer is that, you know, I have the good fortune of working at an organization that is engaged with many of the wonderful solutions that have been offered. Ram talked about Green Visions. We've been, you know, gratified to be a funder, the Climate Solutions Accelerator and RPCC. We're working with the Zoo Society. And so we've been gratified to really work with a lot of partners in this community. But the observation I have is that much of our infrastructure is woefully underfunded. The 15 kids that Pamela's working with thought it'd be 1,500, right? And so the question is, again, where do we get those? Where do those resources come from? How do we reallocate, you know, our economy effectively so that it drives the kind of growth opportunities that are really consequential and necessary for us to move forward? And so, you know, to me, again, we've got to really rethink, you know, the function, the mechanisms that are in our economy and how they function different, so that we've got the resources that are necessary for Green Visions and, you know, RPCC and others.
I mean, one quick thing, because Kelvin's question really fits in with that. He's asking whether you see foundations making funding, you know, for this type of work easier to access for the types of organization, particularly organizations and groups run by Black and Indigenous people of color, doing the work on a really local level. And if COVID-19 or other structural changes are in the works at the Community Foundation, or if you're seeing it elsewhere, kind of from your vantage point.
Yeah, for sure. So, as is often the case, the nadir period, the darkest moments oftentimes reveal a lot about, changes that can be made. And it's certainly been the case that COVID-19 and the challenges of getting dollars out into the community has helped us to rethink the processes that we use, the expectations, frankly, that we have. We've been a proud co-lead with the United Way of the Community Crisis Fund, where in phase 2, we said, let's strip away all of the barriers, let's strip away many of the challenges for application and so on and so forth, and let's focus on driving more resources into Black, Indigenous, people of color-led organizations and those that serve the community. And that was a very, it was a conscious choice because the insight here is that if we are able to strengthen those amongst us that are the most vulnerable, all of us end up being stronger. At the Community Foundation, I mentioned earlier, the Racial Equity Growth Fund, and we've also had a chance to go back and look at some of our processes just to make sure that we're constantly updating them in an iterative way so that we are more accessible, more engaged, getting out of the 4 walls of the foundation and out into the community to engage with people who, Christina Lopez asked a question earlier in the chat about getting dollars to different places. Absolutely, we definitely need to do that, because in so doing, we create more robust, and vibrant grant opportunities for us and subsequent opportunities to strengthen our community.
And Andrew, I wanted to make a comment related to one of the notes I saw in this webinar. Somebody asked about folks who are totally living for themselves. It's the example that Simeon was talking about, the chips game, where in a poker somebody got all the chips. The reality is nobody's going to take these chips with them. One day, each one of us will leave all those chips behind. And it makes sense for folks who are living for just themselves to think about the example between a caterpillar and a butterfly that Rochester shows you, that a caterpillar lives all its life just for themselves, just growing. But when the transformation takes place and it becomes a butterfly, it goes and pollinates the whole world so we can eat. And what a life butterfly lives for helping others. So folks who have lots of money looking for happiness, spread it around and let somebody else enjoy it. You'll be happy and the world will be a much better place to live.
The one thing that I wanted to add is going back to something Pamela brought up around being uncomfortable. One of the most important things to me to create that space of discomfort, which is a huge piece of what I do, is really education. It falls back on education. And what I mean by that is really educating people as to why it's important and why they should be doing things like what Pamela was talking about, what Ram was talking about, and what Simeon has been talking about, which then helps people to kind of come to the table and lean in a little bit more, especially if it's not something that they've been exposed to previously or, thought was that important previously. I think it also falls back on this idea of allyship, right? Especially as we talked earlier about some of the disparities that are existing or bringing money to things that need it the most, especially when we start thinking about racial injustice from a sustainability perspective. When you create allyship or create spaces where people can come and engage in different cultures and learn something, that again allows people to lean into these things that we're talking about all that much more.
Yeah, Kamillah, I'm curious because there's one question here from Jim that maybe I'll start with you and see if anyone else has anything to add. But he's talking about that fork in the road, maybe where capitalism currently is, in social justice and sustainability, being a part of the core purpose versus, maybe just what you see as what was once called greenwashing and now maybe purpose washing. Particularly, making sure that there's startup or tech and innovation businesses that are putting climate and justice issues into their reason for being. Is there room in the marketplace for businesses that don't embrace these sorts of things? I mean, I'd like to think we're moving in that direction, but how do you see it?
I personally think there's room for everybody. And the reason why I say that it is when it comes to diversity and inclusion, and I think the same way as sustainability, it's a journey. I don't think that anybody has it right. I think we're all in this journey together. So I think there's room for everybody, whether it's room simply for them to learn, whether that means, them being challenged by others, or whether that is, them bringing that new innovation that you talked about to the table and helping people to see things a different way that we weren't already before. So I definitely think there's room, but I definitely hear what Jim is saying about us definitely being at a crossroads of doing business the normal way versus being challenged to do it with this thinking of, corporate social responsibility really and truly more at the forefront and a part of the business mission and the culture as a whole.
Well, the incentive for those folks is that they can see the examples of socially conscious and conscious capitalist companies making a lot more money than regular businesses. So if your goal is to make more money, then you should be doing what conscious capitalists do, make more money, but you also at the same time making a bigger difference wherever you are. And there are many examples of companies that do that. And I'm waiting for Whole Foods to open in Rochester so I can do my shopping there.
Yeah, I would also just like to chime in. I mean, it seems to me that one of the challenges that we have is that there's a fundamental disconnect between our financial system, our financial markets, and the kind of real economy, right? And so, I mean, we all know that, there's been an economic contraction that is just, kind of almost beyond comprehension. So we know in the real economy that that's happening, right? We see it in our neighbors, we see it with our friends, we see it with our colleagues, we see it in the companies that we work for, and so on and so forth. At the same time as you're having this contraction in the real economy, the financial markets are setting new highs every day, not yesterday, but are setting new highs, every day, right? And so what is that disconnect? And I would argue that part of it is that we've had a culture with the rise of risk management of chasing the kind of risk-free return. And chasing that risk-free return has led us in this constant churn to distribute debt and other, instruments that are disconnected from the consumptive patterns, right, that we have seen in our country, in our society, and frankly, across the globe. We have to make that connection. I'm so glad Kamillah brought up the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, because we've got to connect our consumptive habits with the real economy, with our financial markets. I think that's an essential component here, right? Because if we don't do that, then what we're going to see, I think, and what we have seen certainly over the last couple of years, not a political statement, by the way, is blowing the doors off of our debt and deficit, right? While driving those dollars again into fewer hands. And that's not functional. We can't do that over the long term. We really can't do it over the short term. And so I would argue that we are probably going to continue to bust the doors off of deficits. I mean, I just see that coming, right? Because we've got to figure out some way to drive dollars into, states. Somebody asked the question, I think Bob Whipple asked the question, the country's broke, the state's broke, the community's broke, people are going to borrow, right? That's going to happen. But again, how we borrow matters. What we borrow for matters. And if we just continue to do this kind of quantitative easing approach, that's not, ultimately the game will end, or we can do this differently and get more money into the real economy, into the hands of people to innovate, to take risks, and to hopefully grow our way out of these challenges.
Well, related to spending, when you borrow, I would say if you are spending it, and I hope in the coming years, we spend money which generates long-term savings. So anywhere conservation, where you're spending $1, now you spend it smartly and save some money, that savings could be reinvested. Same idea applied to energy sector. Installing solar power generation system, which now in New York State is incentivized. It can make you a free community if you were able to build a system or an entity, make your own power. After 10 years, the system is paid for, and it makes power for another 20 years, almost pretty much free, just about at the maintenance cost. So you, by becoming energy independent, are saving a lot more dollars over the life of the system. And you still work with RG&E and local power companies. So invest it in things which generate return for their life. That's the kind of investment we should do while we are creating jobs for the people.
That's exactly right. When I was in college, I remember getting like most college kids, you get these credit card offers, right? So I get the credit card offer and I used it to buy a TV, right? And I spent the next decade paying this TV off, and, now a little older, a few more, gray hairs up top, I can appreciate that. But our economy continues to function like I did in college, right? Instead of, as you said, making smart investments like in education, for example, that pay dividends down the road. And it seems to me that the kind of rigging of the financial system, and again, the kind of manipulation that happens, it seems like ethereal, like it happens way up here, but it has real implications right in Rochester, in our community. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that we want to think through is how we kind of connect some of the activists and the advocacy that's happening right here on the ground with some of these larger themes, so that we can do our part, hopefully with communities like ours around the country, to start influencing the national dialogue so that we take a different track, which is, again, towards sustainability, making smarter investments that help us so that we're prepared for the future.
I think we've been talking about some of the ways that the government can certainly, make long-term investments in ROM. To your point, I think so important to make sure that those are things that are going to be saving us in the long term. But Drew has a great kind of caveat that I'd like to explore, about, not everyone is able to borrow. That things have been stacked against, in credit scores, in all different number of ways. Certainly, Simeon, I don't think that you're unique in being taken advantage of by a credit card company like that. So what are some of the ways, either that you're seeing, Simeon, or maybe others, both that some of those things need to change? And is there a role for businesses to play? Again, given that, this conscious capitalism movement, what can businesses do, to be a part of that change?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think a lot of it is, we've all heard the old aphorism that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so I think that there's some cultural things that we really need to arrest, and really start to rethink how we're using, just language and the way that we talk about how the economy works. I think, there's a lot of headway that our business community can make in that regard. So that would be number one. I think Drew's point is a good one. Everybody can't borrow because of the construct in our system. But those that can, I think, have a responsibility to drive those resources, particularly, remember where we started this conversation. There's a whole history of economic deprivation that precedes this moment. And so out of, due deference for that deprivation, it seems to me that there's a conversation. I'm going to use, a big bad word called reparations. But there's an interesting conversation, and frankly, a fairly elegant one, about debt forgiveness, because we know that, historically, the way that people ended up in slavery often was that indentured servitude is by not paying a debt. But we know that there are a lot of people that ended up in slavery. They never got a chance to get the money on the front end or get the benefit on the front end, right? And so anyways, there's an elegant solution to kind of debt forgiveness as one vehicle to create some reparations and to create some more equity. The point here is that real dollars have to end up in the hands of people that have been disenfranchised. Because if real dollars don't, then not only do those folks continue to feel pain, not only do we lose the opportunity of their ingenuity and their human capital, but it also then creates a lot of headway for our current system. Monroe County, 76% of the budget for Monroe County is in social services, the sheriff's department and incarceration, and health. Those are all expenditures, in my mind, that are ways to remediate challenges that could have been avoided with smarter investments on the front end. So yeah, Drew, you're right. Not everybody needs to be able to walk into a bank and borrow, but everybody ought to be able to benefit from the state using its capacity to borrow and driving those real dollars so that we can encourage risk-taking and ingenuity and shared prosperity. And in so doing, we end up, I think, with a stronger economy. And by the way, that's not socialism. That's just, smart economics. So.
Amen.
Drew has been great in giving us really great questions. And he mentioned in a Q&A too, Simeon, that he wants to talk to you and me about eco reparations at some point, which is a really interesting conversation and one that I want to pursue.
That could even be a future conscious capitalism meeting. I'd like to be a part of that conversation. So we're running close on time, and I want to pose maybe one of the one of the last questions anyways, as we start to wrap up, because, you know, given again that many of our listeners are small business owners or leaders of companies in Rochester, maybe they want to have a purposeful impact, you know, in the areas of environmental and social justice. But, you know, there were some great examples, you know, Kamillah shared in terms of Dove, in terms of, you know, some of these large brands, Ben & Jerry's, some of the ways that they're making an impact. I'd be curious if you all have any examples of companies that you're a part of, or, you know, what you're doing internally, or things that you've seen elsewhere where, you know, how can the smaller businesses really make an impact on some of these issues in our community, but in whatever sphere that they have influence?
I personally think it goes back to the idea that I believe Simeon really honed in on, was around this funding. And I think Ram talked about it as well. There are so many things, like Simeon said, that you can do with money, and putting the money in the right hands, in the right spaces in the community, can drive so much change. Another example that I wanted to give you that's on a smaller scale is, before getting into the diversity and inclusion space, I worked in sales, specifically on a project that was centered around bringing, you know, cheaper and healthy foods to communities that were dominated by moms who had maybe a little bit more disposable income, and so therefore could spend more money on, you know, their kids' health, but also targeting moms who didn't have, you know, the most choices and lived in areas that were predominantly filled with things like KFC and other things like that, where they got food for their children. And a lot of the work that was done was really giving money to small local nonprofits in those areas. So they included LA, Houston, Miami, and New York. And also going into communities. So for instance, in New York City, we partnered with something called Green City Force. And Green City Force is a nonprofit that helps to educate Black and Latinx high school students on how to be environmental stewards, so that once they graduate from the program, they can go out into the community to then get a career in the environmental space. But with them, we started urban farms in the middle of 5 project housing units across the 5 boroughs, where we brought in chefs and employees to talk about the importance of living healthy, composting, and all these other things with this local nonprofit. But putting the money there and just having people show up and talk about things made all the more difference in those communities, and changed the way that people looked at, you know, some of these issues.
Great example. Thanks.
Yeah. I would also, we mentioned Ben & Jerry's. Ben & Jerry's has had a wonderful partnership with Greyston Bakery, who engages in the open hiring model. We were glad with our partners at ESL, Federal Credit Union, to fund the creation of the Center for Open Hiring here in Rochester, leveraging that Greyston model. And we're really intrigued to see the prospects of you know, hiring without bias, hiring without, you know, we recognize that people have a background, they have, you know, the challenges that life presents. Some people, you know, bought the TV that they shouldn't have bought, and other people, you know, got caught in circumstances where they got criminal justice involved, right? We all make mistakes, but the Center for Open Hiring says, well, let's look at where people are today instead of where they've been. And so we're really excited about the prospects of the Center for Open Hiring. I did want to, Chris Widmeyer had asked a question about balancing donations and the philanthropy-based model and then the investment model that I think is an important one. You know, my personal, I have a little bit of an idiosyncratic view on this, but I think that philanthropy is at its best when we're doing the kind of risk capital, being able to, you know, kind of take some of the chances in the nonprofit world. When we see things like the Center for Open Hiring, that some folks, you know, when we first started talking about we're going to hire people without background checks, people, that's crazy, you know. But let's see if it works, right? And we can afford to be able to do that. And if it does work, the question is then how do we translate that into broader policy? And I think that's, you know, really the exciting precipice for this community, is translating some of these, you know, efforts, pilots. You know, Rochester has kind of been, unfortunately, the place of the perpetual pilot. I know that Pamela knows what I'm talking about. And we've got to get beyond the perpetual pilots to where we actually learn from them and then deploy them in the broader sphere, primarily through, frankly, government action in the case of something like that kind of hiring. And if we can model it and show it, the other thing that's cool with Center for Open Hiring is that that's a way to model for the business community itself, which is a really exciting one. And we think that there's a lot of gain, and not just us, by the way, but the businesses that are participating so far, folks like Ty Hookaway at Clean Craft and others, they see some real opportunity that is the business case for engaging in this kind of practice, because bias costs us money. Go figure. So.
Yeah, it's fascinating what happens when you stop spending all that money screening people out and instead invest on their success. Ty's been another one of our founding board members, and Mubarak Bashir has recently joined our board, who's leading those efforts locally. We're really excited that Rochester is going to be the first pilot outside of Yonkers to practice open hiring.
Well, I have a suggestion to make quickly. We're talking about pilots. I would like to have a demonstration project here in Rochester where we can take some place like Plex neighborhood. It's right across UFR, work with UFR, take the piece of land which vacuum oil couldn't clean up, and give us a piece of land to demonstrate that nature can fix it a lot cheaper and give work for people that are coming locally from the local force. So that would be a wonderful place to say, let's allow to show how nature can solve our problems. Give us some funding, give us a piece of land, we'll use local people and get it done.
You got me interested.
Anybody else want to address that one before we move on to maybe a final question or two? All right, so one of the things that came up in the chat, and maybe I'll start with you, Pamela, is building, talking about building what's called, I guess, a sustainability echo chamber, and seeing things at the national level. The Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act is a huge step in New York, and some great things happening locally. Do you see that the conversation is popping up in any unexpected places or people that might signal real systems-wide change?
I think that was Mike Buller that asked that question, if I'm not mistaken. And
Yeah.
I live in the same sustainable conservation echo chamber that Mike does. And I think it's a problem, really. And we need to get out of our own echo chambers on this. I do see some things happening, but I don't know quite how to get out of my echo chamber, because I think everybody believes what I believe, that sustainability is the right thing to do, that triple bottom lines are what we all should be looking at. And it's head turning for me when I see that somebody's not thinking that way. But it's been so great to have Kamillah on this call and all of these national examples. My sister happens to work for Unilever, and she will regularly send me information about their sustainability initiatives and their DEI initiatives, and they're an amazing company. And places like Coca-Cola get a terrible rap, but they are really invested in the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN. And more, we do see companies taking it very seriously. Our own North American breweries here in Rochester is very serious about their triple bottom line, because they're owned by the Costa Rican company. So I think for me, I look more at who's involved in those Sustainable Development Goals, and how serious are they? Is it just lip service, what you call greenwashing, I think somebody called it? But I think that more and more companies are realizing that they can't fake it anymore. That this is getting too serious, not necessarily about their own economic survival, but about all of our survival on this planet. And we also have a generation of people entering the workforce for whom this has always been an issue, climate change, and we're seeing the effects of it. I mean, our agricultural system here in our region is truly feeling the effects of climate change. So it's become something that larger companies cannot ignore. I think that the smaller companies have always had to be nimble and flexible around it, but the larger companies they're getting it from both sides. One, that they know that triple E is important, but they have a generation of employees now for whom they're going to leave. They're going to train them, they're going to invest in them, and then those young people are going to say, I do not want to be a part of a company that is not serious about this. And I can now take my skill set and go down the street and work for this other company that is serious about it. So I think we are going to see that kind of sea change. And I see Kamillah nodding, so I hope she's agreeing with me and not thinking I'm insane.
I couldn't agree more with you. I think that part of that too is the idea around the conscious consumer. Consumers are starting to become more conscious about the initiatives and the work that different organizations are doing. So that's another reason why companies have no choice but to pay attention to it. And that includes, the young people who are coming in and leaving, as well as the consumers that, the company serves. So I think the more that organizations can do to truly lean in and understand what the consumers care about, as well as, what they're being impacted by, and connect with that as part of their mission and their initiatives around some of these issues that we talked about today, the better.
Yeah, we're seeing the same trend in philanthropy, that, there's a real concern for environment and climate change, as a driving interest. The other thing I would say, there was a great article, because the challenge for this conversation is in a particular place like Rochester, where for those that are paying attention, the effects of climate change are very real. But for those that are not, it feels like something that might be a little bit distant, right? Hey, it's really, terrible what's happening for folks out in California. Wow, it really stinks for, people that are in the Gulf Coast. But here in Rochester, we're okay. Bloomberg had an interesting article, Bloomberg News had an interesting article. Cities that were poised to absorb climate migrants face a new challenge. I would encourage folks to check it out. It came out earlier this month on October 5th. And they talked about, Buffalo, and Rochester's mentioned in the article as well, that we have some very, very real pressing challenges that we're going to be confronting in the very near future with both climate migration and the implications of an increased population at the same time as we see a contraction of both the resources to deal with that population, as well as an aging infrastructure that doesn't have, so people say, well, this is a city that was built for 300,000 people. If you add more people to it, yeah, but that infrastructure has aged dramatically, right? The housing stock, the building stock, right? Nobody's riding subways in Rochester anymore, right? So, that requires us to really, think differently. That's a pressing challenge for here, not just, in the kind of global sense, but right here in Rochester, that hopefully motivates us to start taking some action. And then you can count on the Community Foundation certainly being a part of that discussion.
Yes, I mean, you actually, I don't know if you saw Dan Schneiderman's comment, but he was mentioning that article as well. So you kind of, we're on the same wavelength there. And just to underscore what Kamillah was saying, I think is a great way for us to kind of leave this off is, even if you feel like you don't have a huge sphere of influence, what can you do to be a conscious consumer in terms of the brands that you're supporting, the ways that you're voting with your dollars, but then also thinking if you are leading a business, what ways can you really make an impact in the ways that you're doing both internally, in terms of your culture, in terms of the ways that you're leading, but also with your stakeholders and developing those conversations, developing those relationships with a diverse audience, and also making sure that the environment's included. This was a really high energy panel, and a lot of energy from the audience as well. So thank you so much for joining us. Clearly, we're going to have to do some follow-up conversations, but thank you all so much for joining us. We will have this posted on our YouTube channel by the end of the day. So if you missed pieces of it or want to share it with anyone, they'll all also be posted to listen to as a podcast, and you can see some of our past events there as well. And just lastly, just a reminder, 6 to 8 tomorrow is that race commission conversation for minority and women-owned businesses and some of the structural barriers and challenges that you may have faced. There will be ASL interpretation. There will be Spanish language interpretation. Highly encourage the community to get involved, because we really want to make sure that those conversations, all of the voices are heard and all of the challenges are heard, so that we can make sure that the structural changes really do have that positive impact that we're hoping for. Because as we're building back, I don't think we want to go back to normal. Shame on us if we don't make this new normal a better normal, a more inclusive normal, a more sustainable normal. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and look forward to future conversations. Hope you can join us again soon.
Thank you very much.